Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about jails and prisons. And my goal by the end of the lecture is that you will clearly understand the difference between jails and prisons. This is something that society tends to use these terms interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. So, I want to make sure we are all clear on the difference between jails and prisons. And then we're going to dig a little bit deeper into each one and talk about really some of the specifics about jails and prisons. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the folks that work there and some of the opportunities and some of the issues that we deal with as an employee of a jail and prison. All of this, of course, relates back to your syllabus. And ultimately, these concepts refer to the um, objectives 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's go ahead and dig right in. So when we're talking about some of the differences between jails and prisons, we're mainly dealing with who's there and why they are there. Prison, we'll talk about more in just a little bit, but prison, in order to be in prison, two things have to be there, or two factors have to be present. One, you must be convicted. We don't send people in the trial process to prison. Two, your sentence has to be a year or more. That's who's in prison. And we'll talk about that more later. But that's the primary difference. When we look at who is in jail, we're talking about the difference between what we call a dynamic population and a static population. Now, in prison, the population is static. Static means it doesn't change very often. Static is something that's stable. And so in prison, our population is very stable because people are there for longer periods of time. It doesn't change very often. Yes, new people are coming in and other folks are being released, but it is for the most part pretty stable. A jail's population, on the other hand, is dynamic. It is always changing. People are coming in and going out every single day. People are there for very short periods of time. Some people folks in jail are pretrial. That means that they have not been convicted of anything yet. And so because of that, and in our as far as the system is concerned. We also house anyone who has been sentenced to anything less than a year in jail. So anything more than a year is going to go to prison. Anything less than a year is going to be housed in jail. We also use jail for probation and parole violations. Now we talked about those or probation last week. And then let's try this again. And so those folks are going to be housed in jail. Juveniles cannot technically be housed in jail with adult offenders, but a lot of jails are going to have a separate area for very, very temporary housing of juveniles. The mentally ill, depending on the jurisdiction and what's going on, we might just need a stable place for someone to sleep or spend the night so then we can get them into some type of medical facility. Those that are under the influence, for example, if someone is arrested for DWI, the jurisdiction might have a book and release policy. However, if someone is legally drunk, we can't just release them unless someone comes and agrees to take care of them. And so sometimes we just need to use jail to sober up. Sometimes the homeless population ends up in jail. That sometimes corresponds with the weather, the last bullet on this list. So again, I live in Minnesota. We have very, very harsh winters. We definitely see our jail population increase over the winter. We have very limited resources for homeless folks, very few shelters for homeless. And so we do see our jail population increase in the winter months. The federal government is using county jails, is contracting with county jails because their facilities are full. Or if they are transporting folks across the United States, they might contract with a jail to house their offenders overnight while they're being transported. We also see folks waiting for deportation under federal jurisdiction, them using jails as a place to keep them until that process is completed. When I talk about that dynamic population, one of the things to keep in mind is the suicide rates of jail is higher than any other facility, as well as it's much higher than the general population. When someone is brought to jail, their life is very much in chaos. They don't know their future is very uncertain. Whereas when someone gets to prison, they've probably spent some time in jail or they know their future. While someone is in jail, their future is very unstable. And so we do see a much higher risk of suicide in jail than in the general population, as well as in prison. Now, we have seen jails as well as prisons really evolve through the years, and we have first, second, and third generation jails. Now, the first generation jail, and this also applied to prison, think of movies like Shawshank Redemption and some of those very old jail and prison settings. Basically, these have very long corridors. Inmates spend most of the day in their cells, and officers are going to walk up and down the corridors to make sure everybody is there and they are not hurting themselves. Single cells, corridors, and basically the officer walks down in that corridor and then isn't going to come back until their next round. Those are some of our earliest facilities. Second generation jails were built with what we called control booths. So there was a room a lot of times in the center where the officer was behind the wall but could see and monitor what was going on. And then there were day rooms. And this was kind of, again, that evolution. The day rooms, the inmates were allowed more time out of their cells into these day rooms to watch TV, play games with other offenders, but the officers were kept separate from the offenders. Now that brought us to third generation jail, and this is our most common. If a new jail is being built, it's probably a third generation jail. And this is where there is no separation between the officers and the offenders. When I worked in a facility, actually in 2 different facilities, this was the type of jail we had where, yes, the officer has a desk, but the officer is very much out and walking around. The cells are going to be the outer perimeter. In the center is the day room. So inmates are there able, as long as their behavior is appropriate, to watch TV, play games, talk with other inmates, talk with the officer. And the officer is right in with the offenders. And it's considered the most safe place for both the officers as well as the offenders. Now, some research is showing the evolution of what we're going to be calling a fourth generation jail. And we're already seeing some of this being integrated. And basically, this includes some outdoor components. For example, one of our local jails that's relatively new, the windows that are at the highest end of the day room open and allow fresh air in. And so it allows some outdoor aspects into the facility. But that's the evolution that we have seen in jails. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time and talk about who's in jail or some of their characteristics. We do see a pretty large percent who are on probation or are experiencing some type of probation violation or have had prior probation. However, 40% has absolutely no criminal history. This is their first time in jail. We do see a very high percentage of drug use, those coming in under the influence or reporting that they do actively use drugs in their personal life. We also see a very large percentage reporting that they have been either physically abused or sexually abused at some point in their lifetime. Now, we're not looking for cause. This is not excusiology, but one of the things we talk about in criminology is how does someone become an offender? And we know that drug use, as well as a history of abuse, are two very large predictors of future criminal behavior. When we look at the women who are being housed in jail, the vast majority of them did not complete high school. But at the same time, most of them are first time offenders. They too have a very high percentage of drug use in their personal life. Many of them are parents, have given birth, um, and the vast majority of them are there simply because they couldn't afford bail. Now, thinking back to your other classes, we know that those, again, in jail are pretrial release, meaning 60% have not been convicted yet. Most offenders are able to get out of jail and post bail. Very few offenders are not given any bail, where the judge believes that their risk is so high they deny bail. That's very, very rare. The women that are in jail, for the most part, are there simply because they couldn't afford their bail. We are seeing very, very large growth in female offenders, and quite frankly, jails are not prepared for this. The jail that I worked had a female housing unit. It had 9 beds. At any given time, they currently have between 30 and 40 female offenders, and so we're having to get very creative, housing them out of county at different facilities that might have more room. When we talk about ethnicity, we once again see what we refer to in the system as DMC, and that's disproportionate minority confinement. Now, we know there's racism at every aspect, every component of the criminal justice system. Jail is no different. We know that racial minorities are more likely to go to jail than their white counterparts. We see this also a disproportionate. For example, at any given time, African Americans make up right around 15% of the population. On average, they're between 40 and 50% of the jail population, whereas Caucasians are about 70% of the population and account for about 40% of the jail population. So again, the system has identified this as one of the most pressing issues that we have, and we see it throughout the entire system. All right, when we look at who works in jail, again, we see some disproportionate to the general population. Only about a third of the total staff are women. However, when we look at the correctional officers, only about 1 out of 4 is female. So that means where that difference is, the support staff is most often women. And so we see a third overall when we look at total staff. When we're just looking at officers, we see about 1 out of 4 being females. Ethnicity, again, predominantly white. We are seeing some changes there in hiring more diverse workforce, but the bottom line is it is still overwhelmingly Caucasians working in a facility. As far as education and training, most facilities do, at a minimum, just require a high school diploma. However, we see many facilities increasing that to either be an associate's degree or even a bachelor's degree. In the training, it is becoming much more professional. We're seeing a lot more on the job training as well as continuing education. When we look at what it takes to be a good correctional officer, I know many of you are considering this as a career, or if you're not considering it, you should. It's a great foot in the door for many of our other aspects of the criminal justice system, but it's also a very, very good career in and of itself. What's interesting is most agree that the most important skill of a correctional officer is communication skills, both interpersonal communication as well as the ability to write. And so when I'm making all of those comments on your write assignment, again, I'm not taking a large percentage off as far as points, but having good writing skills is absolutely essential in any aspect of our criminal justice system. As far as psychology, they would love for students to have more psychology classes. Understanding human behavior is very, very important. Understanding diversity and being able to be successful in a diverse environment is important. The job takes a lot of patience. That's not necessarily something I can teach you, but it overall does require a great deal of patience. Physical fitness is important in being able to manage stress. It is a very, very stressful job. And so having outlets to manage that stress is very, very important. All right, some of the issues that we're dealing with jails right now. The first one is privatization. And ultimately, now I talked about privatization in probation just a little bit. Basically, this is private companies that run their own jails. And then the county or jurisdiction will contract with that facility to provide the housing for jail inmates. And what's really interesting is again, this depends on where you are at. We are seeing some jurisdictions use private companies more and more. We're seeing some jurisdictions use private facilities less and less. Now, part of that difference is some of the ethical issues that have been involved. So private companies can offer jail services at a much lower cost. But where the questions are coming into play currently is, where is that savings coming from? And sometimes they're not willing to forego some of those issues. Like, for instance, private companies offer much less programming. They may not offer educational services. They might not train their officers very well. The officers are generally much lower paid, and they're not providing continuing training. And so there are some definite issues of private facilities, but again, depending on where you're at, we're seeing growth in some of those areas. Overcrowding for jails is still a problem. However, we are making some improvements in some jurisdictions, but when we look at overcrowding as a whole, we need to ask why. And ultimately, remember, 60% of jail offenders are there as a pretrial, meaning they couldn't afford their bail. And so what we're finding is that the average time to process a case is taking longer. For example, in my jurisdiction, the average felony case is taking 18 months to process, which means if they couldn't afford bail, they sat in jail for 18 months. We're also seeing some longer sentences as far as that 9, 10, 11-month sentence goes, which again, they're going to be housed in jail. We're seeing bail amounts getting higher and higher, which again makes it more difficult to post. So we're seeing offenders, unable to bail out. With that, we're also seeing an increase in arrests. And this is, again, our crime rate is decreasing. However, we're seeing folks being arrested more, maybe for things that formerly they wouldn't have been arrested for. They would have just gotten a ticket, but now we're seeing them being arrested. And so all of those are leading to some of our overcrowding issues. Now, when we look at what we can do about it, we are looking at options to bail. Could we release someone with a lower bail amount, but then have conditions such as electronic monitoring and those options to be released during that court process? Last we talked about diversion programs. That's one way to alleviate some overcrowding in jails is through using diversion programs. We're also seeing some jurisdictions explore having weekend confinement. Now, this has always been an option, but we did see a move away from weekend confinement, and now we're seeing some jurisdictions going back saying, we're going to allow someone to maintain their life during the week, Monday through Friday. If they have a job, they have a family, but they're going to spend the weekend in jail, and that's how they're going to serve their time. All right, so I already talked about this a little bit as far as dealing with women offenders, but overall, we do see education being an issue in jails. 40% of offenders have less than a 9th grade education, or even those that have a GED or high school diploma, they're only testing at less than 9th grade. We know one of the best ways to reduce recidivism rate is by having a high school diploma. And so education in jail is becoming more and more important. We're also seeing some improvements to healthcare in jails, both physical healthcare as well as mental health care. We know both of these have very high needs in jail populations, and again, they're disproportionately represented. We see more people with more physical and mental health needs in jail than we do in the general population. The bottom line is the Supreme Court has decided that yes, offenders do have a right to health care while they are incarcerated to a point. When you think of the level of health care that a welfare dependent person has, the right that someone in jail has is actually a step below that welfare dependent individual. And so, but again, the Supreme Court has said, yes, we do have a right to health care while someone is incarcerated. Mental health, again, is disproportionately represented, or those with mental health issues is disproportionately represented in both our jail and prison populations. And one of the challenges that we have is when someone comes into jail, they may be experiencing mental health problems but have never been diagnosed. And so part of the jail's purpose is to connect some of those offenders with resources. Throughout this week, I am going to be providing some screening that we do in jails to try to identify those with mental health. So watch through that in the announcements and discussion forum this week for some of those screens. All right, switching gears to prisons. When we look at the historical aspect of prisons, we basically have two different systems. One is called the Pennsylvania system. One is called the Auburn system, based after the name of a prison in New York. Our earliest system, however, is the what known as the Pennsylvania system, and this system was developed by the Quakers. And when you think of the word penitentiary, if you see the word penance in it, or penitent, they saw prison as a place to do penance, to ask forgiveness for your sins, is basically what they saw the purpose of prison. And because that, it was very much solitary confinement. That first generation jail, again, remember those long corridors? We saw that in prisons as well. And that was what the system was based after. However, the inmates still worked. However, that work was done in their cell. These were rat-infested, really, really nasty places. And Winston Churchill basically said one of his most famous quotes was, "You can tell how civilized a society is by how they treat those accused of a crime." And so with that, that was one of the reasons we saw some great reform coming in the following years to prisons. In this particular system, mental health issues, of course, they didn't necessarily know what mental health was. They just basically said it was an insane asylum. And if someone didn't have mental health issues when they came into this prison, they most definitely had them when they were released, if they were ever released. Just the conditions basically literally drove people crazy. All right, the Auburn system came a few years later, had some improvement. Basically, inmates were allowed more opportunities to leave their cells during the day. However, they spent the night in jail. They did have the opportunity to be with other offenders during the day. However, that was very limited, and during that time, they were working very, very hard, and they were required to remain silent. And in order to do that and to get the work done, they had very strict discipline. They would become very, very physical with the offenders. Offenders are forced to walk in what is known as lockstep, and what is a picture on this slide is offenders walking in the lockstep. Now, traditionally, offenders wore stripes. Basically, this is just one way. It was one way to demean an offender, similar with shaving their heads. Yes, by having a shaved head, it cut down on things like lice and those health issues. But at the time, and again in an attempt to demean offenders, so if you were of means, meaning you had money, the clothing that you wore was one solid color. Because basically clothes that were one solid color meant that it was cut from one solid piece of cloth, which was much more expensive. People that wore stripes meant that these were pieces of material sewn together. And that's what created the stripes. And so those that wore stripes were considered lower class, where it was a symbol of being poor, and basically lower ranked in the social structure. And so ultimately, that's where stripes came in the original prison uniform. The work that the offenders did at Auburn had great profit potential. Basically, they were willing to do jobs that a lot of people were not, and so the prison saw an opportunity to earn money by the work that the offenders were doing. All right, when we look at the stages of development, we really very much, and I have a picture of a swing because we really see this, what I call the pendulum of correctional ideology. Ideology is just a values or beliefs. We saw this pendulum swinging back and forth and back and forth. And ultimately, when we break it down by time, from the earliest prison, so about 1890 to about 1945, the goal of sentencing that we focused on was retribution. It was very much about getting back and making these offenders serve hard time. But then what was interesting, in about 1945, we realized that the recidivism rate was very, very high. When we focus on vengeance and getting back at offenders, when they get released, they end up right back in prison. So from about 1945 to 1967, we shifted ideologies and really focused on rehabilitation. What can we do to help these offenders? In 1967, we realized that, you know what, helping them in prison is only does so much. So from about 1967 to 1980, we still focused on rehabilitation, but we also focused on that reentry process and reintegrating them into society and helping them make that transition. In 1980, we saw an increase in crime rates. And so from about 1980 to 1995, again, we really focused on incapacitation, just keeping them locked up. And so again, our pendulum was swinging back and forth. From about 1995 to now, basically we have a combination of both retribution, getting even, as well as rehabilitation. We're trying to combine those two goals of sentencing. And this is really combined with incorporating what are known as evidence-based practices. Now, I've talked a little bit about these, and then we will continue talking about them. Evidence-based practices is simply taking the data that we have been collecting on what works, and then creating policies and procedures that reflects what works. All right, when we look at who's in prison today, at any given time, we have between 1.6 and almost 2 million offenders. It does fluctuate a little bit, but for the most part, we stay stable around that population. When we look at who has the most people in jail per their population, actually Louisiana is one of the highest states per population. Minnesota is actually one of the lowest states. And actually, when you look at Minnesota versus Wisconsin, Wisconsin has a much higher prison population than Minnesota. Even though our overall populations are very similar, Minnesota has a much lower prison population. Minnesota really tries to use other options other than prison. Similar to jails, we are seeing an increase in privatization of prisons. However, most of this increase is at the federal level. And so this just breaks down about 6% of total state population offenders are in a private facility, whereas right around 15% right now of federal offenders are in a private facility. Because prisons are dealing with some overcrowding issues, we are seeing prisons use jails for that overflow. We also see when someone is nearing their release date from prison, their prison may be located several hours from their home. And so what we might do is when they're nearing release, we might transfer them to the jail that's closer to their home for them to get reintegrated into the geographic area that they're going to be returning to. Women are the fastest growing population of any prison population right now. We see women prison population growing exponentially, and it's a concern at several levels. We simply don't have room to house the women that are being sentenced to prison. Within gender, we also see, now we've talked about race already, however, when we're talking about specifically women, we see huge race differences. Again, minorities and minority women are being disproportionately confined to prison than any other demographic. We also see poor, uneducated, as well as history of abuse. And again, all of these are concerns to the officials making these decisions. And really, we want to take a look at why. Why are we seeing this disproportionate? And there's a lot of theories as to why more women are being incarcerated. We don't think the crime rate of women has changed much. But what we really do believe is that the court is taking a much different approach to how they handle women, where it used to be the court, for lack of better terms, really felt sorry for women. They were the primary caregivers of children. And so rather than separate them from their children, they would look at alternatives, probation, electronic monitoring, those types of options. The court has become much more willing to incarcerate women than they used to be. And again, race, I've already talked about this. We see huge disproportionate minority confinement in prison, um, as well as jail and as well as every aspect of the criminal justice system. And again, as far as the whys, the system has identified this as one of the most pressing issues. And so we're really challenging our policies and procedures and seeing what role that is playing into this disproportionate minority confinement. Now, again, I've said this in previous weeks. We know that every jurisdiction, every state has a different process. So I encourage you to really get to know, and you'll be doing assignments in this class to get to know how your state runs their jails and prisons. As far as prison goes, most states have a Department of Corrections. They might call it something different, but the bottom line is it's a state agency that manages the prison system. In Minnesota, where I live, we have what are known as MCFs. That's a Minnesota Correctional Facility. Several different locations of prisons throughout the state, but they're all MCFs. So like, for instance, we have MCF St. Cloud. That's a prison here in St. Cloud. We have MCF Stillwater. It's prison in Stillwater. MCF Shakopee. That's a women's prison down in Shakopee. Again, we also see private companies. Probably the largest provider is a company known as Correctional Corporation of America. And they run several private prisons throughout the nation. At the federal level, the prisons are referred to as BOPs or BOPs. It's the Bureau of Prison. And again, they have locations throughout the nation at differing levels of security. When we break all that down and really take a look at, does incarceration work? Ultimately, that's a terribly loaded question because it really depends on how you define work. If you look at prisons, the effectiveness of prisons, if you define that as when someone was released, do they go back? Or again, what we call recidivism rate, then the answer is quite frankly no. Recidivism rate on average sits around right between 60 and 70%. And so recidivism is still very, very high. So then we could say, okay, prison doesn't work. But it's not like we can just get rid of it. Again, we talked about social order in previous weeks. We very much need prison. We know that some folks being free is just simply not an option for them. And so in order to maintain that social order, prisons are very, very necessary. All right, when we look at, again, who's working in prisons as well as jails, prisons more so, we basically have 4 different goals. And no matter what aspect of corrections you work, obviously community safety. Prisons are serving a purpose of ensuring the community is safe from these offenders. As a correctional officer, the operation of the facility, your role, no matter what that role is really promoting that operation of the facility. Security is obviously one of our utmost concerns, yet treating these individuals as human first is also very important. And the bottom line is we really want these individuals to be better when they're released than they were when they came in. Now, we can define better whether it be more educated, more job ready, sober, dealing with some of their issues, mental health, chemical dependency, and all of that really, really boils down to self-improvement. But ultimately, so when we say that, yes, we need to ensure safety, but we also need to ensure rehabilitation. Sometimes those roles can conflict where, I can be sending someone into lockdown because of a rule violation or wrestling someone to the ground um, to keep them safe and to promote safety to others. And then a couple hours later, I might be counseling them about some problems. And sometimes that can be challenging to balance those two roles. We see lots of opportunity for work in a prison as well as a jail, but we generally see more opportunities in a prison. Administrative. Sometimes when we talk about the warden, sometimes the warden is very much an icon, and their role is done mostly outside of the prison. Sometimes it's very political. Um, they're working with politicians to secure funding and programming and opportunities for the overall operation of the facility. We also have a lot of clerical, administrative support opportunities in prison. Custodial, these are going to be the correctional officers. The four goals that I just talked about are all part of the custodial. Now, custodial, I'm not talking about janitors. Those that are responsible for the custody of the offenders. Very much based after the military as far as their ranking and policies and procedures. We also have program staff, those that run the education programs, the recreation, religion, treatment, health, employment opportunities within the facility. We have staff that are responsible for that. Service is kitchen and facility maintenance. And then we also have staff that are working with volunteers. It's not uncommon for the number of volunteers to outnumber those that are paid. A lot of our support programs, religion, recreation, those are done through the work of volunteers. When we're talking about the staff issues, we know that a definite subculture develops among correctional officers. And a lot of that is because of their belief system, their values, and behaviors. A lot of times to be a correctional officer requires a certain ideology as far as your own beliefs and values. And so a subculture is just simply a group of individuals who share beliefs and values. We also know that the work is very, very stressful. And so we see a great bond develop between officers. We have codes of ethics. We have both official codes of ethics and unofficial codes of ethics. Your book talks a little bit. I'm not going to dive much into that. But we do know we have a formal code of ethics for corrections that really talk about the behavior and ethical conduct of being a correctional officer. We also see different personalities come through of officers. We see the dictator. These are those that um, like to make the rules and enforce the rules. Do what I say because I said so. Kind of the opposite is the officer that wants to be your friend and believes that their role in rehabilitation is being very friendly and becoming friends with officers. We see the turnkey officer, they're just there to collect the paycheck. They do the minimum amount necessary to get the job done. We also see the reformer. Those are, and to be honest, these were the new employees that used to drive me crazy. They come in and within a month they want to change everything. They know a much better way of doing everything. Now the best personality of an officer is a little bit of a combination of all of these. We need a little bit, we are definitely in an authoritative position. So we need to know the time and place of, you know what, as of right now, you just need to do what I say now. We want to be friendly. Now, we don't want to become friends, but we need to be friendly. We need to be personable. Turnkey, not that I want to see you do just the minimum required, but you need to understand your place in the hierarchy in the facility. But we also, just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that we always need to do it this way. And so having some innovative ideas and being able to think outside the box. So really a combination of all of these makes the best officers. Prison is still considered a non-traditional workplace for women. And what I've seen through the years and through my experience is women sometimes struggle with this. We see higher turnover for women than men. where women try to either be one of the guys or kind of that motherly figure. And really, the goal is to find a balance in the role in their gender. There's been several studies done that looks at the how women do the job versus how men do the job. And overall, we do see women being less physically aggressive. They use their communication skills rather than the threat of force more. And so women are seen as using aggression less to get the job done. Women see their job much more as rehabilitation, where men will generally see their job as providing security. Women are assaulted less than men. Now, we try to correlate that, saying, is it because they're less aggressive, they use communication skills more? But chivalry is not dead. We do see male offenders being less willing, to assault a female officer than a man. They believe kind of that chivalry, we don't hurt women. We do still see that at some points in the facility. Some are going to argue that women are not able to give backup, and I will argue that women are just as able to provide backup. We need to keep in mind that the need for backup is very rare. It's not as frequent as the media likes to portray it, and ultimately backup is generally multiple individuals, and so women are just as capable of providing backup as men. As I said earlier, we know this job comes with a lot of stress. And it used to be that it was just considered part of the job. You were expected to deal with it because it's part of the job. And this created a lot of problems where we were having correctional officers showing signs of psychological illness, behavioral illness. And what I mean by that is becoming alcoholics and drug use and becoming assaultive in their personal lives. We also saw it manifested physically, weight gain, heart problems, those types of things. And so we've really seen a shift in that. Yes, we recognize it's stressful, and we also recognize that we have a responsibility to help officers manage that stress. And so promoting healthy lifestyles, as well as offering services for officers, especially when a critical incident happens. And we call this the CISD, it's Critical Incident Stress Debriefing. And so when there is a critical incident in the facility, those that are involved, we will call in a team of trained professionals, psychologists and counselors, to come in and work with the officers that dealt with that critical incident to make sure they are processing it and are managing the stress that is associated with it. All right, that is all I have for you on jails or prisons.